The inquiry looking into whether local government elections can be free and fair in light of the COVID-19 pandemic has recommended that the October polls be delayed. Well, let's get further into the implications of this. We're joined by the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa Executive Chair, Tslane, the Progressive Health Forums'Dr Aslam Dasoo, who also made submissions, and Harris Nupen of Molebatsi Attorneys Director Peter Harris. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. Tslane, let me begin with you. I suppose it's an easy pick, really, as somebody who's been part of the electoral systems of this country previously, and having to then consider the findings of today's inquiry. What are your first reflections on this, and your impressions of what needs to happen now?
Well, I would have been surprised if Justice Moseneke and the team had come to a different conclusion. I think, facts have been facing us. It has been quite clear that there was no possibility of really holding free and fair elections under the current circumstances. Now, in terms of the way forward, remember that the IEC does not set the date of the election. It is the Minister of COGTA in terms of Section 24, subsection 2 of the Municipal Structures Act. So the IEC now has got to approach the Minister in terms of Section 8, subsection 1 of the Municipal Electoral Act. That section basically provides that in the event that the Electoral Commission realizes that the conditions do not exist for free and fair elections, then the Commission must approach a person who has set the date of the elections to postpone those elections. So it's an easy task for the IEC. They've got to invoke Section 8, subsection 1 of the Municipal Electoral Act and then approach the Minister. And then the Minister, having listened to them and having listened to the report, unfortunately they are now armed with this report of the inquiry, the Minister then will approach the Constitutional Court, obviously with the support of the IEC. But the person who sets the date of the election is not the IEC, it is the Minister. But the IEC has got the responsibility in terms of ensuring free and fair elections. And it is on that basis that they'll be approaching the Minister in terms of that section that says they can approach a person who has set the date of the elections to postpone those elections.
Mr. Tslane, just so that we're clear, does the postponement of this election, effectively, if an extension is given, does it automatically mean that there needs to be some kind of amendment to the Constitution? Or could you have a process that allows for this extension and a postponement of the election without necessarily amending the Constitution in its current state?
No, it does not necessarily mean that there's got to be a constitutional change. And I think Justice Moseneke, in his presentation, did indicate that there is one aspect of possibilities of constitutional amendment which would require 75% support from National Assembly and 6 provinces. But in a constitutional democracy, the Constitutional Court is the custodian of the Constitution. And therefore, in this instance, just like the IEC has been doing all along for by-elections. By the way, by-elections, that's where now the IEC has the prerogative to make a determination of the date of the elections. And that's why they've been approaching the Electoral Court to postpone those elections beyond the constitutionally stipulated period of 90 days. But in this case, the Constitutional Court, as the custodian of the Constitution of the country, can be approached in the same manner that they've been approaching the Electoral Court to make an arrangement where they will motivate basically for the postponement of the elections. But like I've said, the people who will actually be in the forefront of this will largely be the Minister of COGTA, who's got the responsibility of setting the date of the elections, and the IEC, obviously, in support and armed with the report from Justice Moseneke.
Peter, let me come to you. When you look at and you hear what the IEC is saying, they sound quite optimistic that there could well be an opportunity for elections to be held, so really not wanting to reveal what the next step is. But after hearing today's report, do you think that there's any possibility or probability that this election will go ahead?
No, I don't. I mean, obviously, it's up to the IEC and the minister, as Terry's pointed out, and he set out the processes that would need to be followed in relation to that. But I think, while the former Deputy Chief Justice's report is a recommendation to the IEC, they commissioned that investigation and report, and I think they take its findings very, very seriously. And so when the former Deputy Chief Justice talks about issues of the right to life, bodily and psychological integrity, and when one has cognizance of what comprises an election, and there's campaigning, there's canvassing, there's an entire nominations process, and there are rights to freedom of association. And if in any of those processes there would be a threat to the rights of bodily integrity and the right to life and to health, and the report clearly finds that there is a high likelihood of that. People like Dr. Dasoo and others have given evidence or input into that commission in that regard. He's based his findings on that. I mean, there are two components to free and fair. And then there's the other issue which he raised was that free and fair has to go in conjunction with regular elections. So those components are absolutely critical. Elections have to be regular and they have to be free and fair. And if there is the potential for them not to be free, in that person's rights may be infringed, and he has found that there is that very strong potential in view of COVID and the health risks associated with COVID, that on those grounds he's recommending that it should be postponed. There are other components of free and fair which we can all discuss in due course, but that's his primary finding, and I think in the circumstances that he's correct. He's basing it on the evidence which he's received.
Peter, do you have any particular concerns about, the date, of course, is the proposed date is somewhere in February, but we know, and we'll hear from Dr. Dasoo shortly, that there are no concrete predictions when it comes to COVID-19. And so if we do find ourselves in a situation where next year we're facing a different variant of the virus coming under strain, those conditions could well be used again to seek yet another postponement. Do we not run the risk of being caught in a space of uncertainty perpetually so?
Yes, I mean, this is an unpredictable and it's a moving target, COVID-19 and the havoc and devastation that it's caused and can potentially cause. But I think that the former Deputy Chief Justice can only base his report on the inputs which he's currently received. And these are his findings. It remains to be seen how and what further devastation this virus causes. But from the medical reports and inputs and the inputs of other groupings, including political parties, he's come to this conclusion. But it could, yes, it could well change. I mean, even in the report, it says that epidemiologists have said that at that point we might be commencing our fourth wave. That may well be so, and I certainly can't speculate on that. But on the current circumstances and facts before Justice Moseneke's commission, he's come to a finding, and I think that under the circumstances, that finding will be taken very seriously.
Dr. Dasoo, let me bring you in here. When we look at the proposal of February, is that the earliest, most stable date that we can and should be looking at as a country?
Good evening, Kathy. Yes, the short answer to that is yes. And I'm really glad that both Peter and Terry have prefaced the context of the constitutional obligation to have elections, to maintain the democratic project. And I think every one of the scientists who made input into Justice Moseneke's commission were alive to that particular issue. So the decision or the recommendations I know I made and several others made was that there's every possibility that if we went ahead with elections now, the risk of increased infection, hospitalization, and death was actually unacceptable. We're a country of human rights, and Peter outlined the important human rights components of our democracy and our constitution. And I think it would have been folly to go ahead now, given in particular our low rates of vaccination. So your question about whether we would be not in a similar position in February is very germane. We may have a new variant, we may have the start of another wave, we may have, but it's vaccination that makes the difference. Because if you are vaccinated to a sufficient degree, your population is, the number of deaths drop dramatically. And so you might get the sniffles still from infection, but it won't be a risk that you would face if you had the election now. And I think that for me was the single most important single most important factor in the recommendation of Justice Moseneke, because he cottoned onto that fact very, very cleverly and I think very appropriately, because it's going to be a balance. It's going to be a moving target, that someone has said. But if we get to a level of vaccination that's sufficient to avoid significant hospitalization and significant increase in the likelihood of deaths, I think the democratic project then requires us to hold those elections in the safest possible way.
Let me thank you all for your time tonight. Tslane from the Institute of Election Management Services, Dr. Aslam Dasoo. He's with the Progressive Health Forum.